I'm Henrietta Budai, the Secretary General of Hungary Green Building Council. And thank you very much for accepting our invitation and taking the following 45 minutes to listen to Victoria Barros, the Director of the Advancing Net Zero project at World Green Building Council. So why does Hungary Green Building Council organize this webinar, especially for Hungarian market players? The reason is two simple words. We live in climate emergency and we must act. So now Victoria shares a powerful opportunity with you for acting, because green building is crucial in the fight against climate change. So globally, building and construction account for almost 40% of global CO2 emissions. So if we continue as we have been, the sector will contribute to 6 degrees Celsius of global warming. The world's building stock is expected to double in the next 40 years. So we cannot develop, design, construct, and run building as we have done so far. So green building can also make a significant contribution to meeting the sustainable development goals. So it can promote more affordable and clean energy. It can create jobs and boost the economy. So, and it can inspire innovative design and contribute to climate resilient infrastructure. So the World Green Building Council and its network, as the Hungary Green Building Council is an established member of that network. So we are calling on national and local governments and also businesses to commit to a future where every single building produces no carbon emissions by 2050. So the Advancing Net Zero project can make that happen. So the vision is quite ambitious, but the property and construction industries have the knowledge and the capability to deliver it. So it is achievable, technically, financially, and politically as well. So now you will hear good examples from Victoria for that too. So I would like to wish you a pleasant and useful time, and I give the word to Victoria.
Thank you, Henrietta, for that introduction. As we've mentioned, I work for the Advancing Net Zero project at the World Green Building Council. And the reason that we have a project called Advancing Net Zero, as Henrietta has so nicely outlined, is because of the impact that buildings have on our planet through the consumption of energy and therefore carbon emissions. And that means that they are a major contributor to the extreme weather events that we are seeing increasingly frequently related to climate change. But what that also means is that we are a critical solution for reversing the effects and reducing the impacts of climate change. And actually, it's been commented and reported by several organizations and think tanks around the world that building energy efficiency is one of the most cost-effective ways of reducing emissions, and therefore our industry, our network of green building councils presents a fantastic platform to help drive that through our industry and our sector. However, we've mentioned green buildings, and the World Green Building Council is a network of global GBCs, of green building councils. In order to achieve this type of action, we need to be going beyond green buildings, and so Advancing Net Zero is a global campaign to accelerate the uptake of net zero carbon buildings to 100% by 2050. We have a few main aims as our project. Firstly, to increase awareness and education on both the urgency and achievability of net zero carbon buildings all around the world, to achieve alignment and commonality between the approaches of green building councils and their programs or certification schemes, and finally to expedite uptake in global markets by sharing examples of leadership from around the world in forums and events such as this one that we're hosting today. We have developed a framework for advancing net zero, and most of the concepts are shown here within this infographic. This was developed earlier this year before the launch of our embodied carbon report, so it focuses on operational carbon. But firstly, our vision: by 2050, the entire building and construction sector will be fully decarbonised, and that means all buildings, new and existing, should operate at net zero carbon. But we also have an interim target that from 2030, all new buildings should operate at net zero carbon, and that is in recognition both of the increased influence that you can have through the design of new buildings to be high performance and reduce energy consumption, but also the amount of new buildings that are expected to be built between now and 2050. So our Green Building Councils have several ways that they can engage with the programme and their members in order to advance towards this ultimate goal. One of them might be through certification, and we have Green Building Councils around the world developing certification schemes for net zero carbon buildings. It can also work directly with their members to help them identify solutions for net zero buildings, so that's corporate engagement, working with governments to advocate for better policy towards achieving these types of buildings, and then also developing training and education programs and sharing our message through the advocacy work that they do as a Green Building Council. And in order to achieve that commonality and alignment that I mentioned earlier, we have 4 key principles. Firstly, is that we're talking about carbon. We won't achieve decarbonisation of our sector by focusing purely on energy, because it's impossible for all buildings to generate all of their energy needs on site because of their size or because of their location. And therefore, carbon for us is the ultimate metric to track. It's important to know how much energy is being consumed, but also important to know where that energy is coming from and how it is generated. And it's also important to know how those buildings perform in operation. So we're interested in, yes, how buildings are designed, but actually how they perform on a metered basis. The second principle is about energy efficiency and prioritizing the reduction of energy consumption to reduce energy wastage. And that means we'll reach decarbonisation faster if we are ultimately using less energy. The third principle is to generate the balance of renewable energy, to generate the balance of energy demand from renewables. So that means supplying the remaining demand with renewable energy sources on site where that's possible to generate on the building itself or within the building boundary, but also that might be necessary to meet that balance by providing renewable energy from off-site sources. And sometimes it's necessary to offset residual carbon emissions that cannot be avoided. And then the final principle is about improving verification and rigor. So over time, expanding that scope, which firstly looks at operational carbon, to include embodied carbon, so that's carbon from materials and construction, and then also other impact areas affecting sustainability, such as water and waste. So for us, we've set the definition of a net zero carbon building as highly energy efficient, with all remaining energy coming from on-site and or off-site renewable sources. But our Green Building Councils, through their programs, have adapted and developed this definition in a way that's relevant to their particular market. We have 25 Green Building Councils participating in the Advancing Net Zero project from countries all across our network, from all 5 regions. And that means that they have specific needs and drivers and priorities for their particular countries and contexts. And therefore they take our vision and our framework and adapt it in a way that is appropriate for their particular market to support their members in delivering net zero carbon buildings. When the Green Building Councils develop a program or a certification scheme or a framework, we produce a snapshot, and some of these are published on our website. This one, for example, is from Germany, and it demonstrates how, through the DGNB certification scheme, they have developed a carbon neutral framework for buildings and sites to demonstrate climate positive or climate protection and resilience of those buildings in climate effects. So that includes both reduction of energy demand and carbon emissions. And so it tells you a little bit about the context of Germany, the specific system and framework that they've developed, and also how their framework responds to each of the principles that I just outlined to you. So you can find these on our website if you're interested. There's a few on there from Europe. But the Green Building Councils have taken the definition, the principles, and the mission and vision of World Green Building Council and the Advancing Net Zero programme and adapted it to suit their market. So in the UK, for example, their framework for net zero carbon building takes a whole life cycle carbon approach. So they have 2 tracks or 2 definitions, one that includes operational carbon, so that's the carbon associated with powering and heating and lighting buildings, and then also a track for whole life carbon, which includes, in addition to those operational carbon emissions, the emissions from embodied carbon materials and construction through a building's entire life cycle. So in response to their consultation with their members, the HungaryGBC's Advancing Net Zero programme focuses on whole life carbon. In the Netherlands, they have developed a framework for Paris-proof buildings. So that means buildings that are resilient against the effects of climate change in the future. And so they set specific levels of performance for energy efficiency and carbon emission reduction. In Germany, the system from DGNB is known as climate positive, as I've just mentioned. In Australia, their Advancing Net Zero programme focuses on achieving carbon neutrality, and it does permit the use of offsets to help drive improved renewable energy infrastructure within Australia. In the US, they have released LEED Zero, which is in addition to achieving LEED certification, projects can now be certified for achieving zero energy, zero carbon, zero waste, and zero water. In Brazil, they've developed a zero energy standard, which is actually more focused on projects that can generate enough energy on site. And they set very high levels of energy efficiency standards by actually capping the amount of off-site renewable energy that a building can procure. In India, their framework is also called Zero Energy, but they do allow off-site procurement of renewable energy. In South Africa, it's known as carbon positive. You can achieve certification for net zero and net positive, carbon, water, waste, and ecological impacts of your projects. In Canada, it's known as zero carbon. In Canada, for achieving zero carbon certification, you can achieve it at design stage, but it has to be verified by performance data, so meter data in use. For those emissions associated with the operation of the building, they do not permit the use of offsets, so it has to be completely zero carbon. And then in countries such as Singapore, their response to the Advancing Net Zero framework is the development of a terminology known as super low energy. So in recognition of the high density of the buildings in Singapore, and therefore the lack of opportunity to generate enough renewable energy on site to meet the building's needs, but also a lack of land in Singapore to generate energy within Singapore and relying on renewable energy from outside of the country, they are focusing on ensuring that buildings are as energy efficient as possible. So that means super low energy, and therefore are prepared for a future decarbonised grid situation. So all of these countries and all of these examples from the Green Building Councils around the world demonstrate how they've taken our vision and adapted it for their specific market. And so I look forward to finding out how Hungary will take Advancing Net Zero into your country. In May of this year, we released a status report for Advancing Net Zero. And this report helps demonstrate some of the action that's being taken from our network, from our Green Building Councils, from our partners, and also from corporate entities and governments that are helping to drive net zero carbon buildings. We have an action timeline of Green Building Council action. So right from the beginning, when World Green Building Council launched the Advancing Net Zero report in June 2016, and it looks at the action that's being taken since then from Green Building Councils all over the world that are participating in the Advancing Net Zero project. Things like consultations with their members, launching standards for net zero buildings, launching frameworks, or even in the case of Emirates, releasing a report on defining nearly zero energy buildings in the UAE. There are 9 net zero carbon certification schemes that had been released at the point of producing this report, and 2 frameworks. And so those 11 systems are shown in the report here, comparing how they respond to each of the 4 principles that I set out earlier. And we actually have several more that have been released since then. So I look forward to updating this table for next year's version of the report. We also have in the report some case studies, examples of business action and government action from around the world that set out why they are taking such strong action towards achieving net zero carbon buildings. And government action as well, so cities and states and regions, including the state of California and cities such as Vancouver in Canada, and the sorts of policies and initiatives that they are implementing in order to bring benefits to their citizens. The good news is we're seeing examples of net zero carbon buildings from all over the world, in all different countries and climates and typologies, types of buildings. So the top left is an example of a mosque in Jordan. There is a government initiative to install solar energy on, I think it's 6,000 mosques and public buildings across Jordan, so that they can provide their energy, they can meet their energy needs through solar generated energy on site. The top right picture is of Barangaroo in Sydney, which is a big new build commercial development. Those 3 towers are all office spaces, and the lower low-rise buildings at the bottom are residential and shops and a precinct. It's an entire precinct, a community. And this particular project was built to carbon neutral, so it's very highly energy efficient. It generates as much solar energy as it can from on-site. There's solar panels on top of those towers and all the low-rise buildings. And it has a cooling system that uses water from Sydney Harbour, which is it's right on the Bay of. But it can't meet all of its energy demand on-site, and therefore it uses off-site renewable energy to meet its carbon neutrality balance. The bottom right is a stadium in Brazil, Mineiro Stadium. It was an existing stadium that was retrofitted with all of the solar panels that you can see there on its roof. And for all of the energy that's generated on this stadium, the stadium actually only needs 10% of what is generated, and the rest of the energy is distributed to about 200 homes around in the area surrounding the building. And then in the bottom right is an example of a district scale solution. So this is a affordable housing community in Hawaii that achieved 40% reduction in its energy consumption through energy efficient measures to the buildings, and then meets that remaining energy demand through solar panels for energy consumption, for electricity generation, and also solar thermal for hot water. And that was such a successful program that it's been rolled out into some larger scale projects as well. So we know that net zero is possible. It's achievable in most markets with readily available market technologies. We have lots of companies that we work with that are ready to deliver and are delivering net zero carbon buildings. But in order to achieve the type of emission reductions that we're talking about and to mitigate the impacts of our sector, we need to be achieving these types of buildings much faster, and therefore looking to action at scale, which is why the World Green Building Council launched the Net Zero Carbon Buildings Commitment in 2018 at the Global Climate Action Summit. The commitment represents leadership towards achieving net zero carbon buildings at scale. So that means that all businesses and organizations commit to all the buildings that they own, occupy, and develop to operate at net zero carbon by 2030. So that's 2 decades earlier than the 2050 target. That's all their buildings, new and existing, in their entire portfolio. Cities, states, and regions can also sign up to the commitment, and there's 2 pathways available to them. The first is through policy, so enacting regulation to ensure that all new buildings operate at net zero from 2030 and all buildings by 2050 within their jurisdiction. But they can also sign up effectively as a business, as an organisation, with their own portfolio of municipal or government buildings with the same trajectory, so the same timeline, to achieve net zero carbon in their own buildings by 2030. The commitment is outcome focused. We set the goal as achieving zero emissions, and then each organisation or government determines a bespoke roadmap of measures and milestones and initiatives to reach that goal of net zero, and it can be set as a date sooner than 2030. But the most powerful component of the commitment is, in addition to those buildings and those properties within the portfolio, is that commitment signatories must act to advocate for wider emission reductions within their own business activities, including their supply chains, in order to influence others. And our theory of change is that if businesses and governments and NGOs are all working towards delivery of net zero carbon buildings and creating the demand to help inspire market to deliver them cheaper, quicker, and more affordably and more effectively. And so by creating that demand, and the more demand that we're stimulating from businesses coming out with net zero carbon commitments and targets, governments setting regulations or having net zero plans, and NGOs like the Green Building Councils developing programs and tools to support that delivery, we can hope to see innovation, greater skills and capacity from the market to deliver these projects, creating new jobs, boosting the economy, having deeply efficient buildings and more comfortable buildings to occupy, particularly in the winter and summer months, a decarbonised energy grid thanks to lower draw on the grid from buildings, and ultimately the mass delivery of net zero carbon buildings. So as a reminder of the two principles that make up our definition, a net zero carbon building is highly energy efficient and powered by 100% renewable energy. The other two principles are operational carbon, so it's super important to be looking at how buildings actually perform and being able to track the metered performance of those buildings. And then finally, recognizing where the projects go beyond that scope of operational carbon and look at other emissions, maybe from transport or from water or waste. There's 5 components to the commitment. The first is commit, which I've just mentioned, and setting that target to reduce the emissions of your portfolio or jurisdiction to zero. The second is disclose. As I've just mentioned, it's really important to understand your energy consumption. So we require all organizations to measure, disclose, and assess their asset and portfolio level energy consumption and carbon emissions, because it's really important for you to know that information in order to determine how you'll get to zero. The third component is act. So that means taking that information that you now have and identifying the solutions to develop a decarbonisation roadmap that focuses on both improving energy efficiency and procuring or generating renewable energy to reach an emissions balance of zero. The fourth component is verification. So verify your progress towards your target of zero and demonstrate both enhanced energy performance and reduced carbon emissions at both asset, so building level, and total portfolio. And that can be done through Green Building Council certification schemes. So if you have a target to achieve a certain performance level of LEED, for example, then that helps demonstrate an improved approach to energy efficiency than the local baseline code. And then finally, that advocate piece, which is super important. Using your role as an organisation to act as a catalyst through core business activities with working with your supply chain to achieve further action. I'll provide some examples in a moment. We have an information pack for the commitment that includes this detailed guidance document. So it sets out the eligibility criteria for companies signing up to the commitment, They have to demonstrate that they can create impact through their commitment. The scope of emissions we're talking about, so the commitment focuses predominantly on scope 1 and 2 energy-related emissions. Methodologies for greenhouse gas accounting and identifying data and performance gaps, best practice guidance on energy efficiency measures, renewable energy and offset procurement, building measures to decarbonize grids, verification and certification, and a lot more information. It's all in the detailed guidance, so please let us or HungaryGBC know if you're interested in that information. We're finding through examples of organizations and governments that are signing up to the commitment, we're getting some fascinating and compelling stories about why they're signing up. So from the government perspective, it helps to create signals to market for the transition to a net zero economy and give confidence that if you do act now, then you will be supported through future regulation. And it helps them deliver their own roadmaps and targets and their, in most cases, nationally determined contributions towards supporting the Paris Agreement and therefore the 1.5 degree scenario, and support the private sector in implementing their own commitments through non-regulatory incentives and programs. For investors, net zero carbon buildings represent assets that are secured for the future from both a climate resilience perspective, but also asset value, desirability, and minimizing the risk of stranded assets. They also often have corporate social responsibility duties, so demonstrate fiduciary duties to shareholders, and then preparation for future regulations towards net zero. For companies that own buildings, develop buildings, it's about optimizing the performance of those assets, which may have reduced operating costs and likely higher quality assets, which may also attract higher rental costs. Improving the quality of occupied space by reducing drafts and improving comfort conditions, but also attracting and retaining talent by having a strong focus on sustainability policies and net zero strategies. And finally, for tenants, those companies that occupy buildings and don't necessarily own any, it's about enhancing organizational productivity through improved comfort levels and sustainability performance, having a position to advocate to building owners so that you can have greater control over your consumption, and working with your employees to reduce that consumption through awareness programs to improve environmental performance and therefore hopefully energy costs as well. And also exploring opportunities through the core business activities of that organization to demonstrate climate leadership. So depending on where you are within this stakeholder matrix and where you sit along the value chain, there should be some value and a valuable proposition to you taking a strong stance on achieving net zero carbon buildings. So the commitment currently has 76 signatories. We just announced new signatories as part of our European Leaders Summit in Brussels over the past 2 days. The detailed guidance that I'd mentioned provides all of the information that you need in order to sign up. We have designed the commitment to leverage the network of green building councils across the world to help support you in delivering your commitment and provide tools and resources that help demonstrate that leadership and action towards net zero carbon buildings, including rating tools. When companies or governments sign up to the commitment, they also produce an action plan detailing how they intend to deliver against that commitment, which is just as important to us. So I have a few examples of profiles to show to you. This is Kingspan. This is a product manufacturer of insulation materials and cladding panels, all different types of products that help contribute towards net zero buildings. We're just finalizing this profile with Kingspan at the moment, but we wanted to share it with you as an example of a global organization with facilities in Hungary, and therefore under their commitment strategy, they will require those facilities to be performing at net zero. Kingspan's commitment is to commit to net zero energy in their buildings by 2020 and carbon positive manufacturing by 2030. So hopefully as soon as next year, we could have some examples of buildings from Kingspan in Hungary that achieve net zero as great case studies. So these profiles help set out who they are as an organization, some important statistics about their business, and what they intend to do against each of the stages of the commitment that I outlined earlier. So how they intend to commit and by what date, how they intend to disclose their information, how they intend to achieve net zero through their action plan, how they intend to verify their progress, and how they intend to advocate through their supply chain for greater emission reduction. We also announced Evenr from Finland yesterday as part of our European Leaders Group. It was part of our European Leaders Summit. Evenr is an interesting example because they are actually the asset manager owned by nearly 30,000 students at the University of Helsinki. They are actually committed to owning and occupying their portfolio of assets at the campus to operate at net zero carbon by 2025. And then you can see here the different initiatives that they intend to set out through disclosure, act, verify, and advocate. So companies that sign up to the commitment also can become members of EP 100, which is an initiative from the climate group to promote improving energy productivity. And energy efficiency is a really important component of energy productivity. And that's why we have such a strong focus on reducing energy consumption as well. So in this example from Evenr, they've committed through their action plan to implement energy efficiency measures to achieve EPC ratings of A for all their new developments, upgrading building systems and automation within their buildings to enable energy efficient and automated operations, and also building integrated energy production to help meet renewable energy demand where they can, and then finally renewable electricity from a Finnish wind supplier to meet the remaining requirements for their portfolio. The cities and states and regions who sign up also produce profiles, and we publish all of these on our website when they're announced. So yesterday we were pleased to publish the profile for Valladolid in Spain, a city in Spain with 325,000 inhabitants, and it demonstrates how they are committed to achieving their net zero commitment through both policy. So that first column sets out the regulations that they already have in place with the ticks, but also the things that they intend to develop. So the ones without ticks are what they will be bringing out in order to achieve carbon neutral in all buildings in the city. And then the second column is for municipal buildings, so for their own buildings that they own and occupy. And then also states and regions. They produce these profiles, same thing, depending on the pathway that they've signed up. In this case, it's the policy profile to implement regulation to ensure all 3 million buildings, in this case in the government of Baden-Württemberg in Germany, to achieve net zero carbon by 2050. So in terms of next steps for signing up to the commitment, along with your local Green Building Council in Hungary, we are here to support you along your net zero journey. If you are interested in signing up to the commitment or even starting to understand where to start with net zero, we can support you in that process. If you're ready to sign up to the commitment, then we determine eligibility. We have some eligibility criteria for both the Net Zero Carbon Buildings Commitment and DP 100. We can answer any questions that you have through that process and determine how your current strategy as an organisation is aligned with the requirements of the commitment, and work through all the different requirements in the recruitment process. We have lots of pro formas within the information pack that helps with that. And then ultimately, once you're ready, sign up through a joining form, and then we can announce the signatories to the Net Zero Carbon Buildings Commitment. We like to combine announcements where possible, such as the press release that we had this week and the one that we're now preparing for next week, which will announce more signatories in Madrid to coincide with COP25 in Madrid. And then we help produce the profile, which goes live on the day that the announcement is made. And so we invite you to join a growing community of businesses, cities, states and regions committing to make net zero emissions in the built environment a reality. Okay, so Henrietta, we are very much on time, and we've left a nice chunk of the session of this webinar to open to the attendees for any questions that they may have about the content that I've just presented.
Yeah, thank you very much, Victoria, to sharing all of these with us, with the Hungarian companies. So when I saw the list of participants, they are companies, they are Hungary Green Building Council members, individuals, and we have embassy representatives. So I don't know they are here or not. But we heard a lot of inspirative thoughts and mainly examples that can inspire Hungarian companies and local municipalities and the government itself, I think. So I think this is time to act now in Hungary as well. So that is why we asked you to present it to Hungarian market players, to inspire and to see that we can act, we can do something. So we have now examples in front of us. So we can consult these good examples, even companies or local governments, many in foreign countries. But Hungary Green Building Council is here, and you can ask questions and consultation from us, and you can contact us, and we can connect you to Victoria if you would like, and have more details about the whole commitment or the whole way to achieve your goals. So if you have any questions to Victoria, you are welcome to ask. And if you will have further questions in the future, you can turn to us, and we connect you to Victoria, or we can answer the questions ourselves. So, do you have any question?
Yes, this is Leonard Clerk here from Irota Ecolodge. I actually have a question regarding the different, let's say, interpretations of zero net carbon. Mm-hmm. Could you show me this slide where the different countries are shown?
Yes, let's go back to that. There we go.
Yeah, and basically what I see is that most countries, or almost all, are talking about, you know, low energy, zero energy, carbon neutral. But the British is quite different, that it's the whole life carbon. And I guess that if you use a lot of concrete and stuff, so how is this achievable? This standard, or why is it so different from the others?
Oh, okay. Well, actually, the nearly all of these initiatives reference embodied carbon, but the UK one is specific in that it has a different track for whole life carbon. So the Germany initiative from DGNB, for example, requires whole life calculation and LCA as part of their climate positive calculation. Mm-hmm. In Canada, you cannot achieve certification for zero carbon in operation without tracking and reporting on embodied carbon as part of the project. And actually, I believe phase 2 of the zero carbon standard, which is due to come out in the spring of next year, will also include targets for embodied carbon. They're kind of evolving with, as the markets mature towards awareness and understanding of embodied carbon. So it very much reflects the sort of position that particular country is on their journey to understanding and achieving some of these aspects. The World Green Building Council brought out a report in September, which actually added to our vision that I presented earlier on operational carbon and included targets for embodied carbon reduction. And we've really taken our time to go through all the different scenarios and best practice out there and listing case studies of examples of projects that do address embodied carbon, so through the use of concrete, as you mentioned, and look at alternative options to reducing embodied carbon of both buildings. So it's expected that we'll incorporate something to do with embodied carbon officially into the commitment next year. We're working out what that might look like, but in some cases, the local countries' certification schemes in particular will have had a focus on embodied carbon for a long time. In fact, I think DGNB has had requirements for LCA in their certification scheme for more than 10 years.
Okay, thank you.
We can maybe provide a link, Henrietta and Matt, to the attention of the webinar to the embodied carbon report as well.
Any other questions? Any reflections?
Okay, we have a question here. You can ask questions if you prefer within the questions panel on the webinar dashboard. So we have a question here about nuclear energy. How about nuclear energy? I guess the question is, how is nuclear energy treated within the commitment or within the GBC schemes? So the short answer is that World Green Building Council, within the detailed guidance section, just in the same way that all of these green building councils have developed their own protocol and guidance for what net zero means in their markets, we specifically say within the detailed guidance that for different types of renewable energy, it comes down to the local green building council's definition of whether they will accept nuclear energy as renewable energy source. And so that's because in some markets they treat it as renewable energy, and in some markets it's not treated as renewable energy. So rather than having sort of one position that's applied to every single country, we have allowed the local green building councils to determine if it's appropriate for their particular market.
Any other reflections, questions? Any other question on the panel, Victoria?
Oh, yeah, it looks like we have possibly a hand up from Sophia. I'll just unmute you, Sophia, if you'd like to ask a question.
Hi, so I'm Zsófia Pek from NZCB, and I just don't really understand. Am I right that Hungarian green building is not yet participating in this project, so we don't have a country-specific definition for net zero buildings? Is it?
Yes, you're right. So we are not in the project, but as we became an established member of the World Green Building Council this year in June, so we had the opportunity to look at this project deeper and connect Victoria that we would like to spread the word in Hungary as well, and show the good example to our market players and engage the Hungarian stakeholders to commit, or at least look at in the commitment and work on it in the future, the near future.
Okay, thanks. And the second level is what shall Hungarian enterprise or municipality do as a commitment, as we don't have a specific definition for net zero? So what should be the concrete commitment of a city or of any organization who wants to join?
I think countries that don't yet have a country-specific or market-specific definition, they are happy to use the umbrella definition that World Green Building Council set out. So these are examples of how countries have taken the framework and have adapted it into a concept, whether it's the language or the terminology that would work in their particular market. So zero energy from India, for example, is called zero energy, but actually in our definition, it does meet the zero carbon requirements because it's allowing off-site renewable energy. In some markets, zero energy is strictly on the building generation. So what the reason for sort of showing this slide is to demonstrate that there is the flexibility in our framework to allow different countries to develop different definitions if they choose to, providing they follow the principles that we've set out, because that really helps achieve commonality and alignment, which multinational organizations are really looking to our network to help provide, so that even though there's lots of different terms here, zero means zero. But the reason that World Green Building Council doesn't add a level of energy efficiency, for example, into that definition is that 30% energy or more, 30% more energy efficient or 30% less energy demand in above code in Australia would be very different to the UK or to Hungary, because the level of code is different. And that's why some of the more specific country-based units or metrics, so the methodology of how you would measure it, or an average energy use intensity based on the average for that country, you know, rather than us sort of telling you what the average is around the world or for different climate zones. So that's why there are different countries with different applications of net zero. But in the absence of needing a specific definition for Hungary, then you can use the one that we've developed and have a sort of an indication or an idea of what energy efficiency looks like in your country. Because what we really want to discourage, what we want to avoid, is buildings that are not very energy efficient but buy renewable energy and therefore are technically carbon neutral, but that wouldn't be in alignment with what we've set out as best practice in our framework. So the Hungary specific bit might be energy performance standards that represent best practice in your country.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, if there is no more questions, thank you very much for Victoria for the presentation and the details sharing with us. And thank you very much for all of you who attended this webinar. So as I said before, if you have any questions, please send to us. This is info@ugbc.hu. So this is the simplest email address we can contact. And then it depends on your questions or requirements. We consult with Victoria, or we connect you to Victoria, and we try to go ahead and consult with the World Green Building Council how we can involve you, I mean the whole market in Hungary, and how we can commit more, meaning the national government itself, local governments, and the companies all around the country. So thank you very much for this time, and we will continue.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you, Henry. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.